So thank you very much, Malo. I think nicely bringing in many of the stories that we heard, or the presentations we heard about earlier on today. And our second Ciara of the afternoon is now going to speak. So I'm delighted to introduce Ciara Greene, who is an associate professor I'll let you go in the School of Psychology. And Ciara is a graduate of Trinity, but we won't hold that against her. She completed a PhD in neuroscience in Trinity, gained postdoctoral experience in the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge and at Imperial College in London before she moved to Cork, and then best of all she came and joined us here. So thank you very much, Ciara.
Thanks so much. Okay, hi everyone. So I want to talk to you today about some of the work that we're doing in the Attention and Memory Lab. And really the name of that lab is becoming a little bit outdated because it's really just memory these days. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of background here because I want to take some time to actually talk about some recent studies we're doing. But really, I suppose the basis of all of the work that we're doing in our lab is based on this idea of memory being reconstructive. So a lot of the time when people just casually think about memory, they tend to think about memory kind of operating like a video camera where you can just rewind back and forth. Or they might think of, you have a memory of an event and maybe like that's in a box and you put that box in the attic and then you want to go and retrieve that memory, you take it down, dust it off, and there it is just the way you left it. But that's of course not how memory works at all. Memory is instead reconstructed. We rebuild our memories. We build them as we create them, like we're building a tower built with bricks. And then when our memories are stored in the brain, they're broken down and distributed. And then when we retrieve those memories, we're actually rebuilding them, we're reconstructing them. And some of the time that works absolutely fine, and we reconstruct them more or less the way they looked originally. But a lot of the time errors can creep in. We get confused about what brick should go where, and we add the wrong brick in the wrong place. Or we take a brick that someone's handing us and we slot that in where it seems like it should go. So this reconstructive nature of memory has a lot of consequences in a lot of different areas of our lives. And my lab studies all of these different topics. So we look at things like eyewitness memory, how we can misremember faces that we've seen, and how we can incorporate, how we can incorporate misinformation, about say leading questions that someone might tell you and how that can affect your memory of an event. We look at how we can actually construct in detailed memories of entire events that never happened. And we also look at things like how we can become susceptible to misinformation and fake news. Okay, and all of the different ways that we look at this. And then a big part of this is that when we go to rebuild those brick towers, we often rebuild them kind of the way we think a tower ought to look. So we're reconstructing our memories the way we feel they should have happened, rather than the way they actually did. So that's a kind of a very, very brief summary of the kind of work that we're doing in the lab. And what I want to do today is talk to you about two big projects that have been taking up a lot of our time over the last couple of years. So the first of those was a pre-registered replication of Loftus and Pickrell's Lost in the Mall study. Some of you will have heard of this study, some of you might not. This was a very famous study published in 1995 that demonstrated that in principle you can convince people that a particular event that never happened actually happened, and you can cause them to form a false memory of it. So in this study, Loftus and Pickrell were able to persuade about a quarter of their participants to form a false memory that they had gotten lost in a shopping centre at the age of 5. And it's quite a detailed event. So it's, you were shopping with your mum and your siblings, whatever it might be, you wandered off, you got lost, an old lady found you, brought you back to your parents, you were crying. It's quite detailed. And over the course of this procedure that involves several interviews with the participants, a quarter of their participants formed a false memory for this event. But there are a lot of problems with this study. It was a very small sample, it was only 24 participants, so the results are based on only 6 people forming a false memory. There were some difficulties about how they were defining memories and so on. There have been lots of other studies since that have shown similar results, showing that you can cause people to reconstruct these memories. But Lost in the Mall is kind of the big iconic study, the one that kind of stands out there as the best known. And it's the one that's kind of easiest then to take a target, to kind of take pot shots at if you have concerns about the research. So we thought, right, let's go and run a big pre-registered replication of this. So we replicated this across both UCC and UCD, using a whole gang of fantastic master's students. And we recruited 123 pairs of participants. It's pairs of participants because you recruit the participant along with their parent. Okay, so the way this works is that the participant gives you their parents' contact details, we contact them, they fill in a survey telling us all kinds of information about their child's childhood. So they tell us about real life events that actually happened to their child when they were aged between about 4 and 6. And we also ask them things like, where did you used to go shopping when Sarah was small? And who would have gone with you? And crucially, we asked, did Sarah ever get lost? And if the participant, if the parent can't say with high confidence that their child never got lost, they're not included in the study. Okay, so we do that. Then we conflate that into some information, some kind of summaries of 4 events from the participant's childhood that we send out to them. Of course, unbeknownst to the participant, 3 of those events are true and 1 is one that we made up. And we ask them to tell us as much as they can remember about it. And then we invite them in for 2 interviews, and these take place about 1 to 2 weeks apart. And then we have various debriefing and follow-up sessions later on. So as I say, we send people 3 true events and 1 false event. So these are just some examples here. An example of a true event for one of our participants. When you were 5 years old, your mother brought you and your siblings, Peter, Ian and Lucy, to Disneyland Paris. As you were the youngest and smallest of your siblings, you weren't able to go on the majority of the rides. You tried standing on your tippy toes to make yourself look bigger and reach the height requirements, but it didn't work and you were devastated. And you spent most of the time crying when you were refused from the rides. So that's a true event that the participant's parent gave us. Then we have these, in red here, we have a fake event. So we have a template here of what this fake event looks like. So the structure of it is the same for each participant, but we fill in specific details that the parent gave us to make it feel real for that participant. So you and your mother went to, in this case, the parent will have told us they used to go shopping in Dunnes Stores in Charleville. You were 5 years old, you ran ahead in the shop, and you went to the sweets aisle to pick out your favourite sweets. When you went to look for your mother, you couldn't find her. You became very upset when you realised you were lost and you started crying. An elderly lady found you and helped you return to your mother, and afterwards you both went to the sweets aisle and you picked out a bar of chocolate. So again, we will alter the details here. So we'll have asked the parents what kind of aisles or what kinds of shops would have appealed to your child, what would they have run off to look for, and kind of filled in those details so it would feel plausible to the participant. And then, as I say, we interviewed them over a couple of interviews, using, to be honest, the kind of techniques that we would typically be advising that law enforcement professionals should not use when you're interviewing people. So things like saying to people, okay, well, if you can't imagine it, can you try and think about how it might have happened? Can you try and picture it? And can you then try and think about that and see, can you come up with more details? And then you say to people at the end of the first interview, well, think about it over the next week or so, and then we'll come back again next week and we'll ask you again. Okay, and they come back and we do this a couple of times. And then we coded the interview transcripts for each of these participants. We had a whole very complicated procedure where transcripts were coded by 2 independent researchers who had not been involved in the original interview. And then, so here's just an example of one. So the interviewer is asking, can you tell me about the time you got lost? Tell me everything you could remember. And this participant says, sure, I think I was in the shopping centre in Market Cross with Mom, and we were going to get something in the craft shop. But I think I went in there and, I think I got lost. And then I think I came out of it and I met this woman who was outside. She had grey hair. She was an older woman, and she helped me find Mom in the shopping centre. And then afterwards, I actually remembered, I think we went back in to get like crayons or colouring pencils or like markers, something for drawing. And I went in with Mom afterwards into the shop. So, how would you code this? I mean, this is pretty clear. This is somebody who is forming a memory of this event. This is something that never happened. We made this up, and this participant is remembering this. Of course, not everybody did. So this is an example here of somebody who's just saying straight out, yeah, can't remember anything about this. And then we're asking, are you sure? Can you think of anything? No, nothing. Don't remember it at all. Okay, so there's no false memory there. Okay, so just to jump right to the primary results here. On the left, we have the results from the Loftus and Pickrell original study, okay? So that's their original the booklet survey they sent to people. Then we have interview 1 and we have interview 2. And on the right there, we have our replication. And this is the percentage of people who were coded as remembering that false event by the end of each of these sessions. And you can see, looking at our replication, that by the end of interview 2, 35% of the participants were coded as having experienced a false memory for the fabricated event. Okay, you can see that in the Loftus and Pickrell study it was about 25%, so we exceeded that. And it was within, we had pre-registered criteria, what we would consider to be a successful replication. It was within those constraints, so it was considered to be a successful replication. Interestingly, you can also see that in our replication, the rates of false memories increased at each subsequent phase. That is what we would expect to happen. Loftus and Pickrell didn't find that, but honestly, that's probably because their sample size was so small. So this is kind of what we would expect. It was a really nice finding. And when we look at just the rate of people who believed the event happened, it was about 80% of people ended up believing that the event had happened, but these were the people who actually formed a memory of it happening. So you could convince them of this pretty easily. Okay, so we published this replication paper in Memory just this year, but we also did some additional work on this where, for example, we followed up with our participants afterwards to ask about the ethics of these kinds of studies. And we do this in a lot of our work. We have a whole separate line where we look into the ethics of false memory research and how participants feel. And our participants on the whole were very, very positive about it, provided there was a good debriefing. They really felt that they had learned a lot and that it was worth doing. We also evaluated the effectiveness of our debriefing procedures. We found the debriefing was very effective. That's currently in the final stages of peer review, so it'll hopefully be published soon. And then we also just tagged on an extra paper onto this because we had conducted this study across 2 universities with a large set of master's students. We kind of wrote a reflective piece for the Irish Journal of Education about doing these kinds of cross-institutional replication projects and what we can gain from them and some learning from that. Okay, so that's the first big project I wanted to talk about. Given that you can probably imagine, given the amount of interview time and coding and all of that, it was enormously time consuming. So then we decided, well, we're gluttons for punishment, so let's do another huge project. So this one is about measuring the effects of exposure to fake news. Okay, so you've probably come across a lot of stuff in the media talking about, the harm of fake news. Okay, and news articles and peer-reviewed papers both tend to assume that fake news has very grave consequences, for example, for our health or for our democracy. And you might have seen headlines like, did fake news get Trump elected? How fake news caused Brexit? Fake news's impact on consumers? Or, just to keep things really on the level, fake news is killing us and how can we stop it? Mm-hmm. So you might be surprised then to learn that there is actually very little evidence about the effect of fake news on behaviour. Okay, really, really vanishingly little. And I can tell you that for certain because just last month we published an enormous scoping review where we evaluated every experimental study on misinformation published between 2016 and 2022, and we evaluated the outcome measures of all of those studies. So it was over 700 studies, and what we found was, as you can see there, by far the most common outcome measure, about 80% of studies were measuring people's belief in the misinformation. Of course that's important, we want to know that, but there's often an assumption that belief must translate into behaviour, and that's not always true. Just think for a moment about whether you believe that eating fruit and vegetables is good for you and whether that always translates into you eating a perfectly healthy diet. Okay, there's a big gap between belief, intention and behaviour. Okay, so very, very few studies, in fact fewer than 10% of misinformation studies evaluated real world behavioural outcomes. And of those, the vast majority were evaluating behavioural intentions, so intention to engage in a particular action like getting vaccinated or eating a particular kind of food, for example. We only found one study that evaluated actual real world behaviour. Okay, we've done some of this ourselves. We've done some of the work looking at intentions. So we have done work examining, for example, consequences of exposure to a single piece of misinformation on subsequent behaviours. So we looked at this in a few times in the context of COVID, where we would come up with fake news stories suggesting that, say, vaccines were dangerous or that the contact tracing app had privacy concerns. And then we would measure how that affected people's intention to get vaccinated or download the app. And we found small effects, basically. We found that there were some effects, but they were inconsistent and they were small. And we had very large samples, so we were very well powered to find these effects. So we kind of came out going, okay, we're certainly not arguing that fake news has no consequences. You only need to look at things like the massive anti-vax concerns or things like the January 6th kind of riots in the US to see that these things can have huge consequences. But typically there, what we're talking about is not exposure to a single piece of misinformation. You're talking about people who are immersed in an entire ecosystem of misinformation where they're getting it from multiple sources. So our understanding of what happens if you read one single story that's wrong, our understanding of what that does to you is a very different thing, and we need to examine that separately. Okay, so I'll try and wrap this up quickly. To get at this question, we're currently running this study. We relied on an existing kind of structure that's out there. So there's some really nice work by a load of people, including the late Alan Scaboria's group, showing that if you give people a false memory of having gotten sick after eating a particular food as a child, they will be less likely to physically eat that food later on. So in this study, they persuaded participants that they had gotten sick after eating spoiled yogurt when they were a child. Then they brought them in for an apparently totally separate study later on and asked them to taste yogurt and crackers, and they ate way less yogurt than the control group, but it didn't affect their consumption of crackers. So we said, great, let's do something like that. So we're in the process of this study at the moment. We've recruited well over 1,000 people to the online portion of this study, and where we have a very complicated ruse where we tell people the study is about climate change, sustainability, and food choices. So first, they rate their attitudes to some target and filler foods, and there's a whole list, but mixed in there are our target foods, cashew and almond nuts. Then they read and respond to some news stories. 3 of them are true and 1 of them are fake. So some true stories about quinoa, about plastic packaging on foods, and about water requirements for growing avocados. And then this gross fake story where we tell them that either almond or cashew nuts, depending on their condition, and that 80% of bagged supermarket nuts are contaminated with spider eggs because of deforestation. The control group doesn't see this fake story at all. Then we ask them to rate their attitudes to the target and the filler nuts again. And then we ask if they're interested in doing an in-person study, again, about sustainability, climate and climate change. If they say no, they get debriefed. If they say yes, they come into the lab where we ask them to taste and rate some foods. So first we weigh the foods and we put them into these bowls, and we have our target ones, our almonds and our cashews, and we have some other non-target foods like lentil curls and muesli and raisins. And then we ask them to complete some filler questionnaires that I'm not going to get into now, that we will use, but I'm not going to talk about now. And they're left alone during that for a period of 10 minutes. And importantly, during that 10 minutes, the interviewer, before they leave, says to them, oh, by the way, we have to throw out all this food after you leave for hygiene purposes, so just eat as much as you want. And then they leave them alone for exactly 10 minutes. They come back in, the participant is expecting a whole new section of the study, but instead they get debriefed. Okay. And then they're asked to rate their attitudes to those foods again. And then after they leave, we weigh the foods at the end so we can measure how much they ate. And then our primary research questions, I'm finished, don't worry, is our first thing is we want to know whether exposure to the fake news stories will affect attitudes to the target nut in the online survey. So will, seeing that story about cashews make you less willing to eat cashews? And will that generalize to other nuts, like for example to almonds, to the non-target nut? And then critically, will exposure to that fake news story affect consumption of the target nut in the lab study? And will those effects be stronger for people who form a false memory for the fake news item? So that was very, very rapid. We are about 80% through the data collection on this. We collected most of it last year. We've just got ethics for a new set of master's students to continue with that this year, so we should hopefully be finishing with it soon, and I'll come back and report on my results. And I just want to really acknowledge my partner in crime, Gillian, who I do all of this work with, and then all of the fantastic students and postdocs who've been involved in all of this. Thank you very much.